Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Good evening, welcome. My name is Ian Whittaker. I'm the Assistant Director for Leadership Programs at the Chicago Council. It's my pleasure to welcome you here and to welcome David Ignatius to the Chicago Council to discuss the Syrian conflict and the Middle East in general. We are excited. Before we begin, some quick housekeeping points. We are on the record this evening. We welcome social media, but please silence your phones. And we'll also be live streaming this program, so welcome to everybody watching at home. Some quick upcoming programs at the Chicago Council include tomorrow, the former Bank of England Governor, Lord King of Rothbury, will be here to offer his critique of the global financial system. On Tuesday, April 5th, the Ford Foundation professor at Harvard Kennedy School of Government, Danny Roderick, will investigate when growth might return to emerging markets. On Tuesday, April 19th, we'll have an expert panel discussion in partnership with the Field Museum on efforts to tackle poaching and the global ivory trade. On Friday, April 29th, that's Friday, we will have economist and former Greek finance minister Yanis Varoufakis discussing lessons from the Eurozone crisis. The Chicago Council is a public education institution generously funded by its members and donors, and we aim to make conversations like this evening's open to as wide an audience as possible, so we thank you for making that possible. And on that note, we're actually running a membership special offer this evening. It's a March Madness offer, 25% off regular membership prices for university faculty, staff, and students. And turning back to this evening's program, Mr. Ignatius will be in conversation with the Council's President, Ivo Dalder, and Ivo Dalder will then moderate an audience Q&A. And for the Q&A, we'll actually have audience questions as well as Twitter questions. So if you're watching at home or if you just don't want to raise your hand, you can contact us using the tweet the handle at Chicago Council. Send us your questions and we'll try and get them up there. But first, to introduce tonight's topic and speaker, please join me in welcoming the CEO and lead portfolio manager at Lizard Investors and vice chair and treasurer of the board of the Chicago Council, Dr. Leah Joy-Zell.
Good evening, everyone, and welcome. You are in for a very special experience tonight, together with two very special individuals. David Ignatius is an associate editor and columnist for the Washington Post, where he's worked for 30 years. Prior to joining the Post, he was at the Wall Street Journal for 10 years, where he rose to the position of chief diplomatic correspondent in his mid-30s. He has written biweekly opinion columns for the Post since 1999. David is a consummate professional and a superb analyst of U.S. foreign policy and global affairs. His interest and expertise in the Middle East goes back to the earliest days of his career as a journalist. I doubt there has been a leader in the region that he has not interviewed or gotten to know well over the course of his career. There is also another side to his talent, namely as a prolific and successful novelist, where he has drawn on his insider knowledge of intelligence and the CIA to craft spy thrillers, which includes a 2007 book, Body of Lies, that was made into a movie starring Leonardo DiCaprio and Russell Crowe. So there is another side. And I had the pleasure of serving on the board of the German Marshall Fund with David for 8 years, and I will tell you that I have never met anyone with higher integrity and a better storytelling gene. Ivo Dalder needs little introduction, I would hope, to this audience. As the president of the Chicago Council on Global Affairs and former U.S. permanent representative to NATO, he is both a seasoned diplomat and someone with insider knowledge of diplomatic and security issues worldwide, with expertise bar none. The topic tonight is Syria. After 5 years of violence, which has claimed over 250,000 lives and displaced millions more, Syria has been a leading cause of geopolitical instability in the world with no obvious resolution in sight. What has this conflict revealed about changing power dynamics in the powder keg of Middle Eastern politics? And what lessons can we draw from the Syrian conflict to guide our policy in other hot spots like Iraq and Libya, where weak and collapsing governments threaten global stability? ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming David Ignatius and Ivo Dalder to the Chicago Council on Global Affairs.
Leah, thanks so much for that very, very kind introduction, and thank you for all you do for the council and for Chicago and the rest of the world. Well, it's heartfelt. This is strange. Usually, the journalist gets to ask the question, but now it's the other way around, and I think it's okay because
you want to trade?
No, not yet. I think David is really, as Leah Zell said, one of our truly foremost observers and interpreters of the scene, particularly in the Middle East. So it's a great honor to have you here today. Just to remind you, the reason I'm looking at my phone is because that is where your questions in the wider cyberspace audience, or indeed here, might well arrive. So do send us your questions with the handle at Chicago Council, and we will get to them later. David, let's start with yesterday. You were in Brussels over the weekend for the Brussels Forum. Leah was at the Brussels Forum. It's a city that I and my family have lived with for 4 years. Terror now struck in that part of the world. Was that an isolated event? Was it directly related to the Syrian conflict? Or was it something that lies deeper and more long-term? How do we explain what happened beyond the carnage that we saw?
The short answer is all of the above. Before I start, I just want to thank Leah Zell. As I hope was obvious from her introduction, she and I really are friends. People give nice introductions about people all the time, but Leah and I were together this last weekend at a conference sponsored by the German Marshall Fund, and what do we spend our spare time on the buses doing? Quizzing each other about our favorite novelists and things we really liked about each. So she's a special person. I have other very close friends in the audience. Thank you all for coming. Yesterday was one of those days that just makes you feel the world is darkening. I think we all felt that. There have been too many days like that recently. I think the answer is obvious that I'm going to call it ISIS, is metastasizing. It is a movement that our president is slowly trying to degrade and ultimately destroy, and it is a fact that its domain inside Iraq and Syria is smaller than it was. I hope we can talk about the specifics of the strategy that he has been pursuing and what makes sense and what doesn't. But the obvious fact, which was just viscerally clear to all of us yesterday, was that as the territory is shrinking in Iraq and Syria, it is growing elsewhere. Since the president began this slow campaign of attrition, the number of countries where ISIS has roots, and not just roots, where it's building bases, recruiting people, threatening stability, has expanded. It's now, if you add up all the numbers, it's over 40 countries where it claims to be involved. I was meeting with one of the chiefs of the Australian security establishment who said, this is a real problem for us now in Asia. We're lucky that the bombing incident in Jakarta, you remember, a month or two ago, wasn't much worse than it was. We're worried about this threat. In Libya, which is where ISIS has been diverting a lot of the people who'd like to go to Syria but can't get in, we have now a deeply entrenched, significant movement that is at the doorstep of Europe even more than Syria is. Brussels was a lesson in the way in which this group and the migration flows that have stemmed from the war in Syria, which is a separate phenomenon, but they're all kind of intermingled, really is beginning to destabilize Europe. I should say what I said in print this morning, which is that I think we have to be honest about two aspects of this failure. There is a real intelligence failure on the part of the European intelligence services in dealing with this problem. They need help. They need to break down their own walls. This is a pre-9/11 situation of stovepipe security services that don't communicate even internally. I'm told that in Belgium, the external and internal service and the gendarmerie don't communicate. Ivo would know about that. Certainly, European services don't communicate adequately with each other. The nominal European Union has no intelligence service to speak of. And then finally, the kind of cooperation that should exist between the United States and the European services, especially facing this kind of threat, also doesn't exist. So it's a European intelligence failure. It's also, let's be honest with ourselves, it's an American failure. We are the leaders of the coalition that announced in September 2014 that we were going to attack this problem, and it's getting worse, certainly from the perspective of Europeans. I am told by the people I talk to in our government that there are multiple plots in motion. And I was told this a few weeks ago before the Brussels attack, but I wouldn't be at all surprised if there are other attacks of this sort coming. The fact that the Belgians were so unaware that they couldn't find for 4 months the chief logistician of the November attack in Paris for 4 months, and he was a few blocks from where he grew up. The fact that they captured him on Friday and they didn't have any clue that there was this, significant plot about to happen. I mean, that should really be worrying. We went through a real self-examination after 9/11 in which the most searching questions were asked about how our intelligence services were working. And I think that was very helpful. And I think, a big question for me, Ivo, and again, I hope you'll share your insights, which are deep about this. Big question for me is whether Europe, which has such trouble being honest about intelligence, is capable of the kind of self-examination that's needed now.
Let's take, and I'll come back to the intelligence piece, which I think is an important one. But let's take the crisis back a little bit about where this came from. You wrote in the Atlantic in the fall about the origin of ISIS and this threat, this monster, as a friend of ours, senior Belgian government official, called it when I asked whether he was okay yesterday. This monster came from a particular place, and so let's talk a little bit about where the monster came from, how much it was about Syria and the Arab Spring, how much it was before that in the Iraq War, and how the two came connected. Because I think we will get to the issue of strategy and whether the strategy we're pursuing now is the right one. We need to understand what it is that we're fighting and why it exists. And I think you've thought about this longer, harder, deeper than anybody else. Give us your perspective on that.
Let me offer two starting points. The first is to say that the roots of what the Arab world is now living through go back many decades to the fundamental blockages in their political system. This is a political culture that just didn't give citizens a way to express themselves, and so it's been a fertile ground for the kind of worst kinds of problems and movements. I first went to the Middle East in 1980, and I remember feeling in each country that I visited on that first series of trips the same sense of a broken political culture. In Iraq, in Lebanon, in Egypt, in Syria, each of the countries that I visited in that first year, 3 years of that tour. So I think we have to remember that all of these events take place in a broken culture. The Arab Spring, which I remember in the street in Tahrir Square, was this moment, a sort of ecstatic revolutionary moment. I often liken it to the last act of Les Miserables, people on the barricades, and all men will be brothers and sisters, and all the divisions will disappear, and it was too good to be true, and it wasn't true. It didn't last. We shouldn't really have expected that it would. But that was citizens who lived in this broken political culture dominated by the secret police forces in every country, rebelling and saying, I'm a citizen, I have rights, I want normal life. We shouldn't forget, even as the Arab Spring has darkened to winter, that the aspiration that was expressed was really one that we should feel in sympathy with. The other starting point beyond this broken political culture is the reality that when the United States invaded Iraq in 2003, we kicked the pegs out from under the structure that was providing stability in this dominant Sunni government and set in motion a process that we're still living through. I have to be honest and say, as I do often in print and in public, that I was one of the people who on balance thought that the invasion of Iraq was justifiable. I shouldn't pretend that I understood what a mistake it was back then, but I have to be honest with all of you and myself that looking back, it was a catastrophic mistake, and it will take a long time to recover from. So those are the starting points. I guess the other thing I'd say in helping people to see how this happened, as a correspondent in 2003, 2004, I spent a lot of time in the Sunni areas of Iraq talking with tribal sheikhs who said, basically, my world is coming apart, who were facing the predecessor of ISIS, which was then called Al-Qaeda in Iraq, but there's a direct line of descent. And as we know, I remember one sheikh in Fallujah saying to me, Mr. David, if the Americans don't help us, if the Americans leave, the strong will eat the weak. He said through a translator, the strong will eat the weak, and none of us will survive. And that's kind of what happened in Fallujah and Ramadi until we finally got serious about helping these tribal leaders, helping people in that part of Iraq. I think General Petraeus will always, should be credited with a remarkable job that he did in the surge in strengthening the Sunni resistance, creating a movement that almost destroyed Al-Qaeda in Iraq, but not quite. And I hate to use a cancer analogy, but it's like, a few toxic cells still left. And as we began to pull back, thinking that we'd solve this problem, those very tough, hardened cells began to multiply. And unbeknownst to us, Al-Qaeda in Iraq began a campaign of assassination. I cite this figure often because I think people don't realize it. From 2009 to 2013, 1,500 tribal leaders in Anbar were assassinated by the predecessor of ISIS. If you wonder, how did they cut through like a hot knife through butter in 2014? The answer is they had killed the people who would have stopped them. And we didn't see it. We didn't understand it. It was the very sectarian Shiite-led government in Baghdad didn't care. I mean, killing off the Sunni tribal leaders, not their problem. One final point to make about how this happened. There's this campaign of assassination also in Mosul, which just fell overnight, it seemed, in June of 2014. That's when we all woke up to this. In addition to the assassination campaigns that we didn't see, this group that became ISIS did something brilliant. They raided prisons where jihadists and Iraqi intelligence officers had been imprisoned initially by the United States, and relationships had formed. It's like gangs in American prisons. They're the toughest, hardest, and similarly in these Iraqi prisons, Relationships had formed, and I think they had 5 prison breaks in 2013 where they just blew into prisons, freed hundreds, in some cases a couple thousand prisoners, and they had a ready-made army of the toughest, most savviest people who combined the skills of intelligence officers and the sort of passion of Sunni Salafist sheikhs. And so that's where they came from, and we've been struggling ever since. They swept through Mosul in June of 2014. A year later, after we had said we're going to degrade and ultimately destroy, they swept through Ramadi, the capital of Anbar province. So it's been coming at us, and it's, ultimately, this is an intelligence failure. James Clapper, our director of national intelligence, said it flat out in an interview that I had with him. We underestimated this adversary. We didn't see it coming.
That adversary was focused, and the way you describe it is very much focused on Iraq. Syria enabled it. So the first factor you mentioned, the decaying culture, which really impacted not just Iraq, also really had a huge impact on Syria. The Arab Spring comes to Syria, it gets misplaced. Just put that piece of gloss on it. What is happening in Syria to make this problem not just a recurrence of what we had seen in Iraq in 2005 and 2006, but really now a regional threat that we didn't see coming in some ways either?
Let me give a little bit of personal detail. After Mubarak fell in Egypt, I went from Egypt, from this ecstasy in Tahrir Square that I described, to Syria, because I was very curious whether it would spread. It was on every television set in every household in the Arab world. And so I was in Damascus in late February 2011 and talked with all of the advisors around Bashar al-Assad, who I had interviewed often in the past. I did not see him on that trip, but his advisors kept saying, David, we know that reform is necessary. We know that it's, we have to make changes. We have to get out ahead of this. We're going to do it. The president understands that, et cetera, et cetera. Well, it didn't turn out that way. The demonstrations began in Deraa, south of Damascus, and they were brutally repressed. People were killed in the streets. People were taken to prison and tortured, and so a deep rebellion began among Syria's Sunni population, and it spread and spread. Our very brave, distinguished ambassador at the time, Robert Ford, risked his life to go to Homs and Hama, 2 cities in central Syria where this was happening, just to say America, stands with you. It was courageous. Some people have thought that we were implicitly making promises we couldn't keep. I don't feel that way. I thought that was an appropriate thing to do. But this rebellion spread. In the beginning, there was no ISIS. By the middle of the next year, September 2012, I was personally so confused about what I should tell readers of my column about what was happening in Syria that I did something. Some friends in the audience have heard me say this, but I'll repeat it briefly. I got smugglers to take me into Syria and traveled for a couple of days with the Free Syrian Army, as it was called, the moderate opposition, and traveled to Aleppo, which even then was being destroyed. This is truly one of the most beautiful cities in the Middle East. It kept the charm of olden times, so it was heartbreaking to see it. But on that trip, I came to 3 conclusions, which I wrote when I got out, which I wouldn't change now, 4 years later. The first was that Bashar al-Assad would never control all the country again. You could see traveling back and forth. You could travel for hours and hours without encountering a government checkpoint. Bashar's forces were gone in many places in the north, and you knew they wouldn't come back. So the idea that was proposed then is proposed now, that the Russians seem to have bought into, that you could reinstall Bashar al-Assad as president of all of Syria, no way. Second thing that was obvious was that the moderate opposition, which we were hoping would prevail then and are still hoping will prevail, was a mess. And without the kind of help that the United States could give it seemed to me, it would just remain disorganized and ineffective. And three, and this is the heart of the matter, that unless we did that, the extremists who even then, in September 2012, were becoming the dominant fighters in the north, that they would get stronger and stronger. And I mean, it was just staring everybody in the face. Our Secretary of Defense, our Secretary of State, Leon Panetta and Hillary Clinton, our CIA Director, Dave Petraeus, all urged the President to have an active program of training, helping, assisting in various ways this moderate opposition. The President, who has been allergic to Syria from the beginning, who, for understandable reasons we'll talk about, really didn't want to do this, said no initially, and then he said yes in 2013, but not with much conviction. And so, again, the honest truth, Ivo, is that this has been coming at us in slow motion, but the basic elements of the threat have been clear. We just haven't done anything effective to stop it.
So I think that nicely transitions from, I think, really a terrific analysis of how we got to where we are, and thank you for that, to then thinking about where did we go wrong, and then we'll get to the issue, what do we do now? But let's think realistically. We can also say if John McCain had been president, something else would have happened, but John McCain isn't president. Barack Obama was president. What realistically could have been done in 11 and in 12? We'll get to the red line in a minute. So in those times when there seemed to be still a way to play the various factions before it ran so far beyond where we are and we face the major crisis that we face. Was a no-fly zone something we should have done? A safe area, arming a group of people who were themselves disagreeing often about where it is, when even those who are advocating for action are saying, chances of success, Mr. President, are 50-50, but it's worth a try. How would you make the argument, not knowing what you know now, knowing what you knew then, and you were one of the few who knew what, or feared that you knew what was going on, how would you have said, we need to do this and this is why?
I think it's important not to pretend that there were easy choices. The president's reluctance to intervene in Syria reflected the genuine feelings of a country that was sick of wars in the Middle East, that felt that we had spent too much and gotten too little. I always remind myself that Barack Obama was reelected in 2012 in part because he was saying to the country, against Mitt Romney, who was quite aggressive in talking about the role he wanted America to play in the Middle East, that he didn't want to do that. And I think he was reflecting what the country on balance felt. In a sense, we were all in there with him. I felt back in September 2012, when I wrote what I did, that there was a way that the United States could help provide command and control, structure, stability, confidence to the moderate opposition, and help make it a more effective force. I mean, it really was, and to some extent remains, a mess. We'll never know if that was true. The president doubted it. He We know from this marvelous piece of reporting by Jeffrey Goldberg in The Atlantic that the president just didn't believe it. People came to him and made the argument much as I'm making it, and he wasn't convinced. And looking at the failure of our efforts since then to train moderate opposition forces, you can understand the reasons for his skepticism. But I personally believe that would have been right. I should also say, while it's impossible to be certain what the right policy choices would have been, I think we have to be honest and say that the outcome that we've ended up with is just catastrophic. Catastrophic, tragically, for Syria. 300,000 dead, a country that's completely shattered. But now, catastrophic for Europe. When you have Australians telling you this is a problem. So we know that the outcome that we ended up with was not a desirable one. Some fork in the road that would have taken us away from this outcome, we can't be sure what it was. It would have been wiser to have chosen it. I don't know if you want, Ivo, to talk now about the red line issue.
Do, because, of course, the criticism is up to that point, Mr. President, you may have had good reason for being worried that we would get stuck in another big Middle Eastern war, but you drew a red line, Mr. President. The red line was crossed. There was a period of 10 days where it was very obvious that you were willing to respond, and then you didn't, against the advice of every single one of your advisors, from the National Security Advisor to the Secretary of State to the Secretary of Defense, against your own advice. You didn't cross that line, and what was the consequence both of a decision, which, by the way, in that remarkable set of interviews with Jeffrey Goldberg, he now says was his proudest moment, to not fall what he believed was the trap of striking Syria. How do you see it?
Well, I was amazed, really, that given what we're looking at, the president feels so positive about the choice that he made. Again, I don't think these were easy choices, but the idea that history is going to regard this as having been the wisest choice, I think a lot of us, most of us, would be skeptical about that. It is true that at the time he was receiving a lot of advice to do it, but importantly, he was hearing a lot of cautionary advice from the military. I mean, if you want to hear arguments against deep commitment by the United States in the Middle East, just ask a general. I mean, they have lived through these wars, and they do not want to be asked to start something that the country isn't prepared to finish. So I think he did hear a lot of, Mr. President, the follow-on consequences of this could be this and this and this. It is true that Syria has one of the best air defense systems in the world, that if you were going to take that out and take the Syrian Air Force out of play in the follow-on to an initial cruise missile strike, that would be a complicated operation. So he was getting all this advice, and then he decides, I shouldn't go down this road without having the support of the country after an election in which the country endorsed me as a candidate because I was, in effect, promising not to get into new Middle East adventures. You can understand all the parts of the logic train that led him to make the decision that he did, and then the Russians present what seems like a painless alternative of negotiated withdrawal of the chemical weapons. And again, you can make the argument that in terms of the safety and security of the United States, of Israel, having those chemical weapons disposed of is a preferable outcome. That said, what you can't really quarrel with, I think, is that we can see now that when the President of the United States says that there is a red line, meaning that if you do something, we will respond decisively, with the implication that we'll do it with military force, and the president doesn't follow through on that, his credibility is diminished, and his power is diminished as a result in ways that are very significant. And President Obama has had to live with that loss of credibility and loss of power ever since, and I think it's a problem. It complicates his conduct of foreign policy, whether it's with China or Russia. We're accustomed to all the complaints about America from the Saudis and this one and that, but I think there's a deep concern among traditional U.S. allies that the president is really, very reluctant to use force. So remember the famous Economist cover, something like, "What would America fight for?" And you don't want that question to be raised. So I think we can see in hindsight more clearly than I saw at the time the costs of the decision that the president made. And I think then, as those costs began to be clear, it would have been wiser to seek to bolster the image of the United States, take action. I have been someone who thought that some kind of safe zone in northern and southern Syria, working with regional partners, made sense as a way to begin to move towards something more stable. I felt that for the last 2 years. Again, the president, I described him as allergic to Syria. I think he looks at these options and he just doesn't like where they take him in terms of what might happen. He asks questions that clearly his advisors cannot answer with sufficient confidence to make the president convinced to do it.
Just on the red line, I mean, if you look at the dilemma, it was a dilemma because my sense is that the military options he was presented with really weren't going to fundamentally change anything inside Syria. They certainly weren't going to be able to deal with the chemical weapons threat because we weren't going to be able to strike chemical weapons. And therefore, the logic of the situation he had put himself in was to have threatened the use of force in order to get rid of the chemical weapons through a negotiation, which would have happened. And if he'd done that, if on the day that the red line was crossed, he had said, "We will strike unless you get rid of the chemical weapons," the very outcome he achieved through negotiations with the Russians would have been achieved through the threat of force, as opposed to despite the threat of force. And I think you would have been able to maintain that credibility. The problem was that nobody had thought through, what do you do when the red line is crossed? They just drew a line and didn't think about it. I think that's the process failure that happens inside administrations. It's easy to declare a statement. It's much more difficult to then sit down and start planning, what do you do if, what do you do if, what do you do if, in an integrated way, and he didn't do that. And as a result, I think, as you say, the credibility did suffer in ways that led in part to Russia putting its forces there. It is hard to believe that Russia would have flown in its forces, but for the fact that they thought the chances of the United States responding militarily was pretty small. And if we weren't willing to respond to chemical weapons threats, why would we respond to a bunch of Russian aircraft coming to a base that the Russians had had for a long time in any case? You don't have to comment on that, but that's kind of how I see the.
I think you put that. I should be asking you the questions. You put that like a distinguished former ambassador. The thing that I would add that I think is a lesson of this period and of this issue in particular. I think the president makes clear in his Atlantic interview that he has been trying to, he wouldn't want to use the word retreat, but he's been trying to rebalance. He's been trying to move American power away from this impossible part of the world where you can't achieve much and it doesn't matter all that much to us anymore because we don't need Saudi oil in the way that we used to places that do matter, specifically to the Asia Pacific. But there has been a process of withdrawal stepping back of American power in the Middle East. The president's pretty open about that. And the lesson for me is that as we step back, as we have stepped back, others have stepped forward. Russia has stepped forward. I think that's a non-trivial problem. Iran has stepped forward. Iran is a significant destabilizing force throughout the region. Saudi Arabia has stepped forward. I mean, in some ways, that's good. We've always wanted the Saudis to take more responsibility, but a Saudi Arabia that doesn't trust us to protect its security and takes unilateral actions, well, we've seen they start a war in Yemen, they suspend diplomatic relations with Iran, et cetera. And finally, ISIS has stepped forward. As we step back, all those powers step forward. And as I wrote the other day, is that process in America's interests? The President implies in the interviews with Jeff that it is, and I don't think that it is. I disagree.
I'm about to open up the floor, but I have one last question. I may have other questions as we open the floor, but we are where we are. History will be written by many people, but today we are where we are. We are a day after the Brussels attack. The President of the United States has to look at the consequences of his actions and inactions. Now when he comes back from Argentina, will have to sit down in that Oval Office and say, okay, now what do I do? I have 8 more months. I see the threat, it's real. We may debate how real it is and how existential it is, but it's killing people, and it's making a lot of people very, very nervous and very, very fearful. What do we do?
Well, let me start by saying something that may be counterintuitive. I think in situations like this, where you really are on your back foot, it's important to stabilize and not swing a punch wildly. And when a president's being attacked for not being tough enough, there's a terrible temptation to show that you're going to fight back by taking that roundhouse swing, and I trust the president won't do that. In particular, it's important that the campaign against Mosul, the ISIS capital in Iraq, and Raqqa, the ISIS capital in Syria, not be launched until there are Sunni forces that can do the clearing. And at present, there are not. I'm getting frantic messages from my friends in Iraq saying the Abadi government is talking as if it's going to send the Shiite army and the Shiite militias to take Mosul, and if they do that, that's going to be catastrophic. You can just kiss the Sunni world goodbye forever. So, good point. Let's be careful. That has not been done. That's been the missing piece of the president's strategy, and still is. Same problem with Raqqa. We have this great proxy force of Syrian Kurds who are fabulous fighters, and our special operations forces who've been fighting with them have fallen in love with them. There's one problem, that first they drive the Turks crazy, and we can't just forget about Turkey's interests. And second, Raqqa is not traditionally their area, and they will be resented by Sunnis, deeply resented by Sunnis in Syria. So it's really important to get this right before, and not launch something sort of spasmodic to show that we can do it. What strikes me as more immediately urgent, like has to be done right now, is the European intelligence piece. I wrote a column this morning, and forgive me for plagiarizing myself, but I'm sure students of history remember what was called the Arcadia Conference. In December 1941, after the shock of Pearl Harbor, Franklin Roosevelt invited Winston Churchill. Actually, Churchill invited himself, but Churchill came to America, stayed in the White House for 3 weeks driving Eleanor Roosevelt slightly bonkers. And they had a conference in some auditorium called the Arcadia. Anyway, it's given that name, but it was basically the moment in which the alliance between Britain and the United States was fused. And I mean fused at every level of command. I mean, they had stovepipes then that were as bad as our stovepipes or Europe's stovepipes today. The U.S. Army and the U.S. Navy didn't get along. They were separate services. The British had the same problem. The Brits and American militaries didn't really trust each other. The Brits thought basically we'd just gotten clobbered in Pearl Harbor. Who were we to tell them anything? And this conference burned all that away and formed an alliance that was intense. And Churchill left that conference. He essentially subordinated British power forever after to the United States. But he left the conference saying, now I know we're going to win. It's going to take a long time, but now I know we're going to win because the combined power that's represented by us, but really American power, in the end, nobody's going to withstand that if it's really applied systematically. The exact same thing is true now about this problem of ISIS. And if we really had a convergence of American and European power with Arab allies to deal with this, and it was done at the top level, and the President of the United States led it and insisted that we really were going to do this and have unified command, unified intelligence, real sharing, going to finally knock down the stovepipes, we would all say, I don't know how long it'll take, but I know this is going to be solved. So I think that would be my answer to your question. That's the thing that needs to be done right away. Planning for when to take Raqqa and Mosul should be deliberate, careful, wait till we really have the forces. But this part of it is urgent because I think there are more attacks coming at Europe, and maybe to us.
I'm tempted to comment. I read the column with great interest, and there's a logic to it. I worry that the politics, not only here, which we know, but the politics in Europe will make it very unlikely for people to be willing to make that step, even if you see what happened just a few days ago.
But don't you think, you know Europe as well as anybody, shouldn't we, I understand the obstacles, but shouldn't we, as FDR and Churchill did, roll through them, insist that this has to be done?
No, I actually, for the first time reading the column, said I think I know how I do that. It would take the United States leadership in a way that we haven't seen on this issue in particular. It would require a very high-level meeting at the top, which we haven't seen. And remember, we haven't had a summit-level meeting on this issue. It would be a first, and in and of itself, a summit-level meeting in Brussels, by the way, not a bad place to have a summit right today, of these leaders might well get you to the point. But the obstacles are big. I mean, in Brussels alone, the problem isn't just between external and internal security forces, it's between Flemish-speaking and French-speaking, and it's between the three different regions within the city of Brussels itself who don't talk to each other. That said, the urgency was demonstrated for anyone who was trying to fly out of Zaventem Airport yesterday at 8 o'clock in the morning. Let me open it up.
I'm now going to call this the Daalder Plan.
No, it's definitely not. Let me open up the floor. Please raise your hand. Wait for a microphone until I recognize you. Way over there on the right outside. And please make sure that your question indeed is a question.
What we've heard from our distinguished guest today is that the administration policy has been benign neglect, if you want to say it. How about if it was active support to Assad? The red line was read in Syria from the president to the foot soldier as a green light to do whatever they want as long as they don't use the chemical weapons. Plus, the United States reportedly worked hard so the rebels don't get certain quality weapons there. So what do you think of that?
Well, I think there's some truth to what you say. The chemical weapons were replaced by what the Syrians call barrel bombs, which are kind of primitive anti-personnel bombs that are typically dropped from helicopters and kill a lot of civilians. And the Syrians ask, you were so worried about chemical weapons because those might threaten you, but we get barrel bombed and you do nothing. I think that's one reason that a lot of us, Secretary Clinton, candidate Clinton is one of them, have argued for some kind of safe zones that reduce this threat to civilians. Happily, thanks to our tireless Secretary of State Kerry, we now have a ceasefire since the end of February, which is actually holding pretty much. And I have been talking to Syrian rebel commanders, to others from Syria, just to make sure that this isn't a mirage, and they tell me no. And they say further that they are now, with the ceasefire in place, able to conduct operations against ISIS, both in the north and in the south, that have been fairly effective. So, as one would have hoped, with a ceasefire, it begins to be possible for Syrians who I think don't really want to live under extremist ISIS rule to push back. And also, interestingly, probably the deeper menace in Syria, the group called Jabhat al-Nusra, which is affiliated with al-Qaeda, has gotten wrong-footed with the Syrian people. They try to force people to put down flags commemorating the 5th anniversary of the Syrian Revolution, infuriating townspeople in Idlib and other parts of Syria that the questioner probably knows about. So, those are developments that I think are more positive. But it is true that in the years after 2013 and the resolution of the chemical weapons issue, we basically left Syrian civilians unprotected as Assad, and then Assad, with Russian military support, very aggressively attacked our supposed allies.
We talked a lot about, and I have a question here from Twitter. We talked a lot about what the U.S. can do, but as you said, the local powers need to be part of any solution. And Christopher Devine sends a question over on Twitter saying, what role must Turkey play in Syria in the crisis in order to move forward? And let me also, what role has it played? What part of it is? How much is it part of the solution, and how much has it been part of the problem?
Well, I think it's been part of the problem in that it's been unable to control and close its border, which has allowed ISIS to resupply and allowed the flow of foreign fighters, which our intelligence agencies number at 38,000. 38,000 foreign fighters have come to Iraq and Syria, mostly via Syria, since 2012. I mean, that's a staggering number. So they've come through Turkey, and whatever else you'd say, Turkey should have controlled that border more effectively. There's so many things in the Middle East that just break your heart, and one of them is Turkey. Turkey was a country that was moving fast in the right direction 10 years ago. It was becoming richer, more democratic. The era of military coups and suppression of people's freedoms seemed to have ended, and it was just a very positive period. That process seems to be reversing over the last several years as Erdogan has become a more autocratic figure, as there have been crackdowns on newspapers, on courts, on other institutions of civil society. And I think particularly dangerous, there was a rapprochement between the Kurds of Turkey and the ruling party of Erdogan, the AK party. And that's now gone into reverse. And some analysts of Turkey will tell you that they are nearing a point of real ethnic war inside Turkey, which would be catastrophic. I mean, it would be, if anything, even worse than Syria. So I am, genuinely concerned about Turkey, and that's one reason. I mean, Erdogan worries me, but that's not a reason to kind of throw this whole thing overboard because we're so angry at Erdogan. It's really important that we understand Turkey's deep concerns about the people we're fighting with in Syria. The Syrian Kurds, who are our key allies, that the Turks are convinced, not without reason, are allied to people they regard as terrorists, and they think it's unacceptable. And we just have to pay attention to that. So so many other things you could say about the regional allies. There was an interesting news story today, one of the rare positive things coming out of that part of the world, that said that there seems to be a little bit of a rapprochement developing between Turkey and Israel after what's been, 3-4 years of bitter hostility. Erdogan called the president of Israel, President Rivlin, by telephone and expressed condolences about the loss of Israeli lives in the latest bombing in Istanbul. Dori Gold, who's deputy foreign minister, maybe I forget what his current title is, but he's a top Israeli official, has been in Istanbul in the last few days. So that's an interesting new development. It's slightly changes and I think improves the situation.
Right here on the fifth, just on the side. I'll come to you next. No, sir.
Thank you.
Yeah.
You explained why the president had all these problems about going into Syria and so forth because of the disagreements of the generals and everything. But that different is in Libya, where there was a treaty between the United States and Libya when they're giving up their nuclear weapons that they would be protected. So there was a case where he went in and fought a war in an area there, which has now become another area of victory for all these bad forces. He doesn't have any of those kinds of excuses where Libya is concerned because he violated a treaty. Isn't that important?
Well, I hadn't thought about the treaty commitment, but I'll look more carefully at that. That's not well known to me. It is surprising that a president who felt so deeply the lesson of Iraq was don't kick out the pegs of the existing structure unless you have a better idea of what lies ahead, did precisely that in Libya. Now, you could say that he was doing so at the insistence of our European NATO allies, and it's true. The French, the British, in particular, were clamoring for this intervention. Sarkozy was all but demanding that the Americans do it. Ivo, I think were you ambassador at that time?
Yes, I remember it well.
Well, this is the person who could tell us all the terrible secrets. I don't want to shed any tears for Gaddafi, and I think it is easy to be falsely nostalgic for the age of the dictators. They were horrible. The problem is that we didn't figure out in Libya, as we couldn't figure out in Iraq, how to help people make a transition toward a more stable system of governance in which they have a stake. And I think it is true that we tend to think that democracy, and I'm going to put quotation marks around it, by which we mean elections, is a panacea. And Libya had elections, just like Iraq had elections. And I remember the ecstasy about people, the green fingerprints or whatever they were, they had elections. And it turns out that was not a stabilizing factor in either country. But I think I know from discussions with people in the White House that the president concluded that Libya had been a significant failure of U.S. policy, but he has not so far been able to do anything really to improve it. They're working on it. They finally have, I think, a good mediator working that problem. But it's just a final thought. It's disturbing to see all the countries where we have tried to get this issue of how to project power and stabilize countries in transition. You know, we tried it obviously in Iraq and failed. We tried it in Yemen with great effort. You know, all the different parts of the U.S. government, in secret, publicly, we failed. We've been trying to get the transition right in Egypt. It doesn't seem, you know, just go down the list. Libya may end up being the scariest because it's so close to Europe. It is a jumping off point. I am told that ISIS is really building an infrastructure there that should concern us. You know, that's tomorrow's problem.
Well, as they say, you know, we invaded and occupied Iraq, and it's a mess. We invaded and did not occupy Libya, and it's a mess. We didn't invade and didn't occupy Syria, and it's a mess. And perhaps the U.S. may not necessarily be the independent variable in this.
Why does the president want to get away from the Middle East? I don't understand that.
A gentleman over in the back next to the pillar.
Mr. Ignatius, since I'm probably the only Middle Eastern here. But anyway, I've read audiobooks. Still, my favorite is Agents of Innocence. I think it was the first...
Probably mine too.
Yeah. It was the first most balanced American point of view regarding the Arab-Israeli conflict. I've read your director, most recent book. I really admire it. I've actually passed it on to some of my colleagues at the consul. I'm the Egyptian Consul General here in Chicago. But anyway, I have a question. I'm not going to dwell about the Arab Spring, what went right, what went wrong, or anything of the sort. But how would you perceive the conflict in Syria at the moment? Or in other words, what's American policy regarding the conflict in Syria in light of America's relations with Sunnis and non-Sunnis in the Middle East? Thank you.
Well, our policy, to briefly summarize what I think it is to degrade and ultimately destroy ISIS, to Russia to create Russia and the United Nations through its emissary Staffan de Mistura, to create a political transition in Syria. We've said that we hope that elections will take place in 18 months. You know, the Russians are said to be working to try to put together a broader, more representative transitional government in the meantime. And so that's the policy. I think when you push that a little further, many people will say that for the foreseeable future, Syria is going to be effectively cantonized, that there will be areas that the government controls and other areas that the government doesn't control, but hopefully will be stable. And the question is, you know, who will assist the stability there after ISIS is cleared. And I don't think I don't think there's clarity yet about how to do any of that. I mean, unfortunately, we're at the end of this administration, and the next president, whoever he or she is really going to have to focus on precisely the issue that you cite. Personally, I think the efforts that Secretary Kerry has made working with the Russians, Secretary Kerry is in Moscow, I think, as we speak. He will see Putin over the weekend, in the next short while. You know, that's a tremendously promising process, given that this is a country that's absolutely shattered. And I think it's, you know, if the ceasefire continues to hold, there is going to be a growing confidence among Syrians that this talk of political transition isn't just noise, but it's real. And you know, as I'm sure you know, there are all sorts of things that are happening on the ground quietly to try to broaden the ceasefire, to open contacts, to begin to restore services. All the things that you would want people to focus on they are in fact trying to focus on in private.
Gentleman right here.
ISIS's appeal? Man, why did the 38,000 people go? What do they think they're fighting for?
Well, it's a great question, and there are other experts that I would defer to. Graham Wood has written, I think, brilliantly in The Atlantic about the kind of religious, ideological roots of ISIS. The part that disturbs me is what seems to be the youth gang-like appeal of the ultra-violence. I'm sure many of you have read the Anthony Burgess novel, A Clockwork Orange, which imagines a future in which ultra-violence, spreads among young people and becomes a toxic, terrorizing force. And, among angry young Muslims growing up in Europe, in particular, ISIS has had the appeal, come to the caliphate, build our state. We have been rejected, despised, abused, and now here's our chance. And among the people who were appalled at the level of violence that ISIS and its forebears were inflicting, believe it or not, were Osama bin Laden and his senior advisors. If you look back in the record, the Abu Musab al-Zarqawi was really the founder of ISIS, it was then called Al-Qaeda in Iraq, began showing videos of people being butchered back in the 2003, 4, 5 period, drawing a sharp rebuke from bin Laden through his top aide, Atiyah, and from his number 2, Ayman Zawahiri, who said, this is not good for Al-Qaeda. This wanton violence will disgust Muslims. People they'll turn away from us. Bin Laden wanted to change the name of Al-Qaeda. He got so upset about this. In his last year, there's this amazing exchange in which he goes through a list of alternative names for Al-Qaeda because he thinks they need to rebrand themselves because of... So despite a lot of people thinking that this toxic, extreme violence, and believe me, if I don't want anybody in the audience to look at these videos, but the things that they have put on film, not since the Middle Ages have we seen barbarism, public barbarism like this. It's truly shocking, but it doesn't seem to have alienated young people. Again, it's this sort of youth gang cult feeling. I keep hoping that will burn out. Gang membership ebbs and flows, but I don't see the signs of it yet. And as just a final thought in response to your question, if you think of how appalled all of us were to look at the footage yesterday from the Brussels airport and the subway station, imagine what that looks like if you're a young jihadist. If you're somebody who in your heart just feels this rage. You look at this, you look at frightened people in the West, people cowering before the power of your organization, and you feel proud of what has been accomplished. And I just can't help but feel that these will be seen as successful attacks that show the rightness of our cause as we see our enemies tremble. So that really worries me.
The lady here in the 3rd row, if you wait for the microphone, it'll come towards you.
I'd like to hear your comments about President Obama's drone strike program, which many people consider his initiative and a successful initiative because it's striking at the terrorists in their training camps and avoiding collateral damage that we saw so much of in Iraq.
Well, I think it is fair to say that President Obama has aggressively used drones to attack Al-Qaeda and is increasingly using drones in the war against ISIS. And I think the president feels, and I've heard this said widely among military and intelligence people, that the ability to be more precise in your targeting, to linger over the target until you're sure that the family that was visiting so-and-so was dispersed, and then you shoot your missile, reduces the collateral damage in a significant way. And people would say, if you want a comparison between that way of going after adversaries and the old way, just look at the Russian bombing campaign and all the civilians the Russians have killed. There is something about drones, about these unmanned things hovering over, shooting missiles down at targets, that I think makes all of us uncomfortable. I would just note that we are now entering a period in which drone warfare, undersea drones, drones on land, we are entering the age of unmanned killer robots is the simple term to use. This technology is coming at us as fast as the driverless car. I am amazed. It's something I've become really fascinated by in the last 6 months. We're going to soon be in a world where you can, with facial recognition technology, you could, in theory, put the face of Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi into your AI system and send that killer robot off and say, keep going until you find this person and then kill him. And the world in which that's possible is just around the corner. So one should note, the arguments are made, and I've heard human rights advocates endorse these arguments, that civilian deaths are far fewer with the use of drones than they were before. I note that. But there's something I think that all of us feel that's, we're entering a new era of warfare, and it's scary.
Time for one more question. The gentleman at the end. Yeah.
To your youth gang analogy, could you speak to the economic situation that may have contributed to this? We were in the Middle East and Syria in 2011, and just a tremendous number of young unemployed people, including men, and it seems to contribute to that youth gang type situation.
Well, the youth gang problem, I think, is acute in the Muslim communities of Europe, where there is a sense of marginalization, even among people who've been fairly prosperous. I mean, there are a lot of British Muslims who've done pretty well, but who still feel a deep disaffection. My French friends tell me that the Muslim population in France is just too much a separate world, that the French have been trying to figure out how to be more like America. We have an amazing ability to give people a stake in our country, so that enough of them will feel they're part of it, that they'll say, my friend Sammy down the street has been acting strange. That has not been possible in France, Belgium, other countries. You just look at what's happened in Belgium, and the one thing that you know is that no one in Molenbeek has been talking about the people who were in the next apartment building. The people must have known these things, but they have been so alienated, so separate from the authorities. The authorities have not had the community contacts, the intelligence penetrations, just the things that security services do, so they didn't know enough. That's what the story of the last year is, in simple terms. They are not inside these neighborhoods and groups. I think in the Middle East, unemployment, the lack of economic development is chronic. I'll just say one final word, because it's something that's very important to me. I think I've used World War II analogies already. I'm going to use one more. One of the really brilliant things that Franklin Roosevelt did was in 1944, when you could imagine that the war would be won, there was still an enormous amount of fighting and bloodshed to go, but you could see that it would be possible to be victorious. He encouraged the process of thinking systematically about the institutions that would provide stability after the war. So it was in 1944 that Bretton Woods met to think about the future monetary system. It was in 1944 that early thinking about the World Bank was done. It was in 1944 that the way in which the United Nations might operate began to be thought out. And I've begun a kind of personal project trying to think about how could you help people in the Sunni world have a 1944 moment where they begin to think, what's the future governance of these Sunni areas of Syria and Iraq that have been so dispossessed? I mean, they have economic problems, as the questioner implied, terribly. But the governance problems are even worse. So now's the time to begin thinking about that. I mean, if I've learned anything from this cascading series of disasters that we've been talking about, that I've been watching in my career, it's that we need to think more with people in the region about think 1944. What would a different world look like? And then help them to build it.
David, thank you so much. Please join me in thanking David Ignatius. That's good.